Yeah, so that's a good question. You have lots of wars. So practically speaking, there's battles with Arabs in Central Asia, and these are going on throughout the 8th century, with territory being won, territory being lost, alliances being made with one group or another, and then alliances fracturing. It's a battle with the Tang and with these very important city-states in Central Asia who are essential for trade. And the Arabs, the Tang, the Tibetans, the Turks, the Turkish, they're all trying to take possession of these areas and have influence over these areas, because that's the economy of the period. This Silk Road economy is going through these city-states. So these come to a head many times in battles fought between the Tibetans and the Arabs. It becomes particularly contentious towards the turn of the 9th century. So 790s into the early 9th century, there you have this period in which Al-Mamun has all of these campaigns against the Tibetans, against the Tibetan king of Kabul, or a Tibetan puppet in Kabul, or a Tibetan ally, I should say, in Kabul, who falls to Al-Mamun's forces. And then they're trying also to punish the Tibetans for the Tibetans' attacks on the Arabs over the course of the previous decades. So one of the things that we have here, when we're just thinking about military history and all of these alliances and all of these battles and all of these captives, is there's a huge cultural exchange going on. It's not just people going onto the battlefield and shouting and swinging swords at one another or shooting one another with bows and arrows. You have captives. You have people moving across huge masses of land, right? When you as a Samarkandi are taken prisoner by the Tibetans, and then you're forced to fight on the southwestern frontier against the Nanzhao, right? You're displaced. You've gone thousands and thousands of miles over totally different cultural areas. And of course, cultural interchange happens during that time as you get to know the languages. People start to talk with you. So warfare is one of the ways that these sorts of religious and cultural and linguistic exchanges were precipitated, right? Not just in the form of captives, but also at this higher level of embassies and ambassadors coming into the Tibetan court and going from the Tibetan court to the Tang court to the Turkish, to all of the different kingdoms that were operative at this time. And it's a changing landscape, especially when you're looking to the north and the Turks and the different alliances that are moving between the Tang and the Tibetans and the Arabs. Yeah, so he's I think one of the most fascinating figures in Tibetan imperial history. Right, we talk about Song Tsengampo as this axial figure, this founding figure associated with Buddhism, but we don't have too much to go on besides the architecture, the temples, their orientations, the objects that we can find in them that might date to that period. When we look at Trisong Detsen, we have some statements that appear to come from the man himself, where he talks about Buddhism. He talks about why Buddhism should be adopted by the Tibetans. We know about his youth. We know that he was for a time out of power, right? His father was killed in a civil war. The civil war was raging from the late 740s to the mid 750s and culminated in his assassination in around 755. So you have this period of great instability in Tibet. Tibet's losing on the battlefield all over. In Central Asia, among the four garrisons, they've lost just about everything. They're losing to the Chinese in the northeast, and they are really in a bad spot. And then domestically, you have this assassination of the emperor. So the prince, Song Detsen, at that time, has no footing. He's still in his minority, and he tries and fails to establish himself and to establish Buddhism. In around 761, he seems to make some headway and tries to establish Buddhism. as a religion that people can sign on to, not as the exclusive official religion of Tibet, but as an official religion of Tibet that his counselors and his generals are going to swear to uphold and swear not to persecute. So that initial move to adopt Buddhism in 761 is ratified later on with his Samye inscription. He builds this great temple, Samye Monastery, with this royal symbolism, a mandalic structure with Mahavairochana at the center, this tantric imperial form of Shakyamuni Buddha, who is seen as a kind of homology to the emperor himself. Just as you have Mahavairochana in the center of the mandala, you have the emperor in the center of his realm, radiating out in the four directions. So this imperial statement, this imperial architectural statement, is also an occasion on which he publishes two documents. And these documents give his rationale for adopting Buddhism as an official religion. And it gives a kind of short catechism, which is interesting because it shows you how the emperor himself understands Buddhism in terms of karma, in terms of reward and punishment, in terms of the cosmology of rebirth that is being introduced into Tibet at that time. So that becomes his signal achievement. He presides over this decisive turn of Tibet towards Buddhism. And this happens through him at an elite level, right? He's getting generals and counselors and their families to swear to abide by Buddhism. And this might be seen as a kind of a litmus test also for rooting out those who oppose him, those who opposed his initial effort to establish Buddhism as a state religion as part of his establishing himself and showing his ability to marshal support for his projects, here in this case, Buddhism. Later histories see those who resist him as aligned with Pun, aligned with another religion in Tibet, which is sort of projected retrospectively backwards as a fully formed anti-Buddhism at that time, but which was nothing of the sort in the 8th century. So you have in these later histories these sort of supposedly Bunpo opponents of Trisong Detsen, where he's this great Dharma king and he's opposed by the forces of the Pun. And especially this comes into play around funerals and how the emperor should be buried. All of his ancestors are buried in these massive tombs, and these tombs have trenches around them, and those who study tombs have distinguished various types of trenches in terms of sacrifices, in terms of victims. Often you have horses and the bones of horses in these trenches. And then you have some tombs that are distinguished as somehow Buddhist. Often this is because of the statues that are found by the tombs, because of temples that are erected there, like the temple that was erected on top of Song Tsengampo's tomb much later on. But Trisong Detsen appears to have incorporated elements of tradition and traditional burial and its sacrificial practices, and Buddhism as well. Right? So he marks that transitional period where you're using Buddhism as a state religion, as a tool for creating consensus and creating alliances, and as a new way for the aristocratic clans to negotiate power. Right? Now you can become a monk who advises the Tibetan emperor. Now you can become the Kalyana Mitra, the spiritual friend of the Tibetan emperor. And then you have bureaucratized elements of this too, where you could become an abbot who has jurisdiction over the temples of a particular area. You have Dharma colleges that are built up all around the empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, where Buddhism is promoted, and where you have ordination of monks and nuns in the service of the Tibetan emperor, right? Performing rituals on his behalf, rimdo, performing vicarious confessions for him, as was done by Chinese monks and nuns for their rulers as well. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, because you have at that time I mentioned the 750s as a low point. The 790s are about a high point. So for the 4 decades or so that he's ruling, or the just about 50 years that he's ruling Tibet, the military advances continue, the cultural advances continue. Tibet becomes a greater and greater empire. So it's a time of good prosperity. There's a downturn towards the very end of the century. But for the most part, he's presiding over a time of great prosperity. And when we think about the cultural orientations of the Tibetan Empire, a lot of it is somewhat opaque towards the beginning when we're looking at the 7th century. Central Asian influences, Chinese influences from the south, from India and Nepal. And we have, at some point in the 9th and the 10th centuries, not a decisive, but a marked turn towards the south, towards Indian Buddhism. And in the story in later Tibetan histories that is told, this happens at one big event, the Council of Tibet, where you have Hushang Mohayan or Hashang Mahayana, this Chinese Chan monk, who's arguing against Kamalashila. Kamalashila is the student of Shantarakshita, the Kempo Bodhisattva, who's so important with bringing Buddhism into Tibet, with the foundation of Samye Monastery, together with Padmasambhava and Trisong Detsen. And you have Kamalashila representing Indian Buddhism in this gradual way of practicing the perfections and adhering to the laws of karma and trying to do this lifetime after lifetime, or at the very least doing it gradually over this lifetime if one is fortunate enough to traverse the bhumis in one lifetime, the levels of the Bodhisattva path, that is. Whereas on the other side, on the Chinese side, in this story that you have in these later Tibetan religious histories, Hashang Mahayana is painted as somebody who doesn't really care much for ethics, that enlightenment is available through no thought in this very moment, and one need not practice this gradual path of the perfections. So with the supposed total victory of Kamalashila in the Indian camp over Hushang Mohayan in the Chinese camp, you have this idea that, okay, now we're not really interested in Chinese Buddhism anymore, and it's going to be turning decisively towards India. When we look linguistically at the earlier translations of Buddhist sutras, and we look culturally at bureaucracy, at letter writing, at record keeping, at warfare, at quite a lot of the Tibetan Empire, we can see that China was so important during this early period. And this idea that it was just completely cut off through this debate, and now it's only India and the Buddha Dharma and the land of the Aryas, Pakyu, as India is constructed before too long by the Tibetans, where you see this dialogue between India and Tibet and this idea of continuity in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. This writes China out of the picture, right? And it gives a narrative that's a little bit misleading in terms of continuing Chinese influences on Tibetan religion and on Tibetan culture. But in the story that's told, it's Trisong Detsen who presides over that debate. Yeah, so one of the things that happens is that you have this model, and I mentioned it as a kind of bog standard imperial model. You're the emperor, you bring prosperity and health to your people, and you conquer in the 4 directions. So this is a kind of model that just about anybody can have, just about any petty king can have. But to actualize it in a real politic sense of being an empire and ruling over culturally and linguistically disparate peoples, you actually do need to conquer in the 4 directions, and you need armies to do that. You have to feed those armies and have manners of requisitioning soldiers. The Tibetan Empire was famous for producing armor and arms. Their chainmail was famed and was mentioned by the Tang in many different contexts. When they take captives or when they win battles, they talk about, the Tang would talk about recovering 20,000 suits of armor or something like that to show the astronomical numbers and the booty that they were taking. But one of the stresses that happens in supplying all of these soldiers with food and with weapons and giving them all of the necessities that they need to have these campaigns is that you need to keep going and you need to keep moving, and it's seasonal, of course, right? you still need to harvest. You have to have the economic wherewithal to do this. So you have these different systems of granaries also to be able to withstand blight, to be able to withstand a failed harvest. Taxation systems in Tibet become more and more sophisticated in order to support the society. So it's not a subsistence society anymore. And you have objects of trade. You have musk, mentioned the armor, metalwork, also yak tails. Those things that have been staples of the Tibetan economy and Tibetan international trade for quite a long time. Horses as well. So these are the main items of Tibetan trade. But then when we're looking at the economy and their participation in the wider economy and outfitting their troops, you have some areas on the Sino-Tibetan frontier that were referred to as Tibet's granaries, because the Tibetan troops would just wait around for the Chinese to do their harvest, and then they'd show up and basically extort them and say, okay, give us your grain. We'll leave you enough to live on so that you can do this again next year, and we'll see you next fall. And so this kind of thing would certainly happen, and this was part and parcel of the operating structure of all of these empires along the Silk Road, where we're looking at extractive, centralized governments, in a sense predating upon the traders and the trade that's going from city-state to city-state across the Silk Road and taking their cuts. And sometimes when you have these unauthorized caravans that are supported by rival interests, well, you can just sack them and take their goods. So this was part and parcel of the operating structure of the Tibetans, but also the Turks, also the Chinese, also the Arabs. So it is not a very, I was going to say, it's not like our benevolent free trade models of the present, but I think some people might see parallels there as well in terms of the extractive force of governments. Yeah, I mean, Dunhuang's a fascinating example because you have 3,000 or 4,000 people living there. And it's a center of artistic production. It's a center of sutra copying, of making images, of carving out cave temples in the Mogao grottos, which are a few miles away from Dunhuang, from Dunhuang, also known as Shazhou. So you have this Chinese city that falls to the Tibetans in the 780s. And the Tibetans come in and install their administration. You have Tibetan officers with the kind of Chinese underclass as attachés to the Tibetan officers. And you have Tibetan rule there for generations, right? From about 786 to about 848, you have the Tibetans as the rulers of Dunhuang, of this city. And they're engaging in the same sorts of cultural productions that have happened there for centuries, copying sutras, making images, dedicating temples. You have Tibetan monks and nuns there in the temples, alongside Chinese monks and nuns, Uyghurs as well. So you have a multi-ethnic city, but majority Chinese, ruled over. I should stop that, shouldn't I? So as a Chinese living in Dunhuang under Tibetan rule, you would be multilingual. You would learn Chinese at home. You would speak Tibetan and write Tibetan if you were going to write a legal case or write a letter or a petition to somebody. You would, after a few generations, be given a Tibetan name also. So this marks the sort of Tibetan cultural dominance. So there might also be a sense of discontent with Tibetan rule in that one could not really rise above a somewhat subaltern status as a Chinese inhabitant of Dunhuang. The Tibetans were always in the prime leadership positions, usually with the Chinese one step below them and one rank below them. We have petitions from Chinese from Dunhuang who are trying to redress this situation. And the Tibetan response to it appears to have been to placate them by giving them bigger titles. Right? So you give them a bigger title, but you don't actually give them true power. And in that, I suppose they were taking a page from bureaucrats everywhere, but also from the Tang, who were very big on giving large titles to their enemies in order to placate them before they enacted a divide and rule policy. So that would be the situation for the Chinese living under Tibetan rule in Dunhuang, being governed by Tibetan law, being with tax being collected from them by Tibetan officials. Well, first, let's just look at the traditional narrative, because I mentioned the story of the three Dharma kings, and you have Repachen as the third Dharma king. His actual name is Tritsuktetsen. Repachen means the guy with the dreadlocks. And the guy with the dreadlocks comes into it because you have this image in later Tibetan religious histories where he's called the two-headed one, the Udeni, where his dreadlocks go out and they go onto two cushions by his side. Then he's got two monks sitting on the cushions. So we talked about the symbolism of the mu cord and the mu ladder and turning that upside down being a kind of reversal of the symbolism of kingship. You have something not so dissimilar going on here with the hair of Repachen. Just as Drugom Tsempo had debased himself by turning those upside down at the request of Longam Tadzi, his subject, and thereby brought himself onto an equal plane with humanity, now you have symbolically something like the mu cord being sat upon by monks. So you're putting these monks up above the emperor. So this is something that can be read in a number of ways, right? The goal of going back to heaven has now been supplanted by the idea of taking a religious vocation, becoming something like a monk, or that which monks are supposed to actualize, which is Buddhahood. We have prayers for emperors to attain Buddhahood. We have emperors now calling themselves bodhisattvas as well. But a second reading, or another reading of that image, is that he's derogating his role as emperor to these monks. And you have that too with this idea that monks like Denkapelgi Yunten, counselor monks, a new sort of vision of power in Tibet where one is a monk, but one is also a supreme counselor, are getting too much power there. So that old model of the clan supplanting the emperor is now still effective, but it's clans supplanting the emperor who are also monks, and they're bringing to bear the authority of their role as monk in doing so. So another part of that narrative, the traditional narrative, says that Trisongdetsen allotted 3 houses for the support of each monk. So you're one of those households. You have to, in addition to all of your other tax obligations and feeding your own mouths, you need to support a monk. We have it that this was increased under Repachen. And this is seen to be, or it's implied to be, a little bit too onerous, a little bit too far. He's supporting the monks at a level that is extravagant, and the subjects don't appreciate this. So you have this idea that he's too pious, right? That he's giving up some of the aspects of kingship in the name of being, a good Buddhist. So when we look to the real politics situation of the time, to the extent that we can understand it in the 9th century, which I should say is not as well documented in Old Tibetan sources. The Old Tibetan Annals stops in the 760s, so we don't have year-by-year, play-by-play for the 760s to the 840s, the end of the empire. And similarly, the Old Tibetan Chronicle doesn't have much to say about anything in the 9th century. So we have the Tangshu, we have the Tang Annals, and we have Chinese sources to go on, and then we have Tibetan religious histories written centuries after the fact. But this was a time, we can say, of global decline in Eurasia. We have Nanzhao coming to an end. We have the Uyghurs coming to an end. The Tang limps to the end of the 9th century, but it is really limping. The Gui Jun throw the Tibetans out of Dunhuang in 848. They end up setting themselves up as a semi-independent state, and then you have a lot of small states of Uyghurs, of others on the eastern end of the Silk Road there, who are the remnants of the Tibetan Empire. So it's like a fragmentation, and that's how it's presented in later Tibetan histories, as the inverse of the creation of the empire. At the start, according to the traditional narrative, you have 12 minor kingdoms, and then the Tibetan emperor, Pugyal, unites them. And that's how the Tibetan Empire begins. At the end, You have this fragmentation that goes into different small principalities. And this is accurate in the sense of what did happen with the fragmentation of the Tibetan Empire, this global collapse that happened at that time in the 840s and the 850s. What exactly precipitated all that in terms of the ecology and the economy of the time? That's a complicated question. And, it is very difficult to find causal reasons. Why did this collapse happen exactly then? I'd say Songtsen Gampo is important to study today because he's a great example of an axial figure, this kind of figure that is many things to many different constituencies. So for school children in the PRC, he's the origin of the partnership between China and Tibet, or between the Chinese and the Tibetans. He also, by virtue of his relation as nephew to Tang Taizong, is subordinate to the Chinese. For centuries in Tibetan religious memory, he has been essential to the narrative of Tibet as the place favored by Chenrezig, favored by Avalokiteshvara, as his particular field for conversion, where he intervenes at various moments in Tibetan history as various leaders, chief among them Songtsen Gampo, who establishes Buddhism in Tibet and makes Tibet the Buddhist nation that it is still imagined to be today, even if that nation is right now imaginary and not real. So that, in terms of looking at axial figures in those two constituencies, is fascinating too when one, say, tries to find the historical Songtsen Gampo underneath that, and queries the relationship between the historical Songtsen Gampo and then these Songtsen Gampos of the Chinese communist imagination and the Tibetan Buddhist imagination. Does there necessarily need to be congruence between the historical kernel that we can find and what people are doing with them? Does the one undermine the other? And this, of course, is a question that people ask of axial figures across cultures. So I think that's what makes Songtsen Gampo so fascinating. And unfortunately, we don't have so much to go on for finding that historical Songtsen Gampo. We have bureaucratic records from the Tang and from the Tibetans that give us glimpses. And then we have a massive amount of later legends, such as the Manikambum, which make of him this central figure in Terma literature and revealed treasure literature, and transform the imperial period into this golden age of Buddhism,